Kaedahara Kazuha is one of the most highly rated characters in Genshin, often stated as one of the few characters who are close to being an essential pick for any account. But there are two other characters who can occupy the same niche, and Dendro has changed the game dramatically. So, is Kazuha still really that good? Kazuha's role is to be an extremely powerful support, providing several different utilities to the team. Let's look at each utility in detail first, then see how this role in general fits into different team archetypes and how its value has changed by the release of Dendro, before seeing how the other characters who can fill a similar role compare. The first utility is crowd control. When you use Kazuha's skill, it sucks enemies in towards him, staggering larger enemies and knocking smaller ones completely off their feet. He leaps into the air, and his next plunging attack also creates a vacuum which pulls enemies towards him. The importance of crowd control when fighting mobs of enemies is hard to truly grasp until you've experienced it for yourself. When you can group enemies close together, battles become exponentially easier. You no longer have to waste time hunting them down one by one to kill them off, and your character's attacks will be far more likely to hit multiple enemies. This is particularly effective with characters whose attacks trigger a lot of damage, focused on a small area of effect. For example, Ayaka's burst causes a ton of damage in a tightly focused area. By sucking all the enemies into that area just before you cast her burst, you can multiply your DPS many times over, especially if you apply Hydro first to keep them all frozen in place. The ability to stagger larger enemies is also often underrated. There are many enemies who perform powerful attacks at the end of a long animation, and if you can interrupt this animation, you gain a significant advantage. The second utility is elemental damage bonus, provided by the passive ability he gains upon his 4th ascension. When Kazuha triggers a swirl reaction, this passive provides an elemental damage buff to the element he swirled. If Kazuha swirls multiple elements, he provides this buff to each of those elements separately at the same time. This works extremely well in a wide variety of teams, regardless of whether you are using a rainbow of 4 different elements or even a mono-elemental team. The strength of this buff depends on his elemental mastery stat, which is great since that's already the highest priority stat for swirl reaction builds. As a result, the main focus on Kazuha's builds is his EM, though a healthy dose of energy recharge is valuable too. A good target for a highly leveled Kazuha is 1000 EM, which would provide a 40% damage bonus to any element he swirls. Elemental damage bonus buffs are quite rare in Genshin. Most of the time, you'll only increase this stat via equipment or through self-applied passives or abilities, most of which only apply to one character at a time, though it's worth noting that Sucrose's C6 unlocks a similar party-wide buff, which is weaker and more limited in scope. Kazuha's ability to increase other characters' elemental damage bonus is highly sought after as a result. His passive can trigger while he's off-field, so his buff gets great uptime when triggered by his elemental burst. The third utility is to shred enemies' elemental damage resistance, provided via the 4-piece Viridescent Venera artifact set. The VV artifact set is a staple in many teams, as it's one of the main reasons that many Anemo characters are highly sought after. When an Anemo character who has this 4-piece set equipped triggers a swirl reaction, the opponent's resistance to the swirled element is reduced by 40% for the next 10 seconds, which can drastically increase the team's damage. Just like Kazuha's damage bonus, the VV resistance reduction can apply to many elements at once. One caveat to this set is that the character has to be on field when triggering the swirl reaction for the set's bonus to apply. This can sometimes be worth keeping in mind, though Kazuha is well suited to triggering the bonus. Both his skill and burst have a very generous area of effect and immediately trigger swirl reactions with ease. So what kind of teams can be built around Kazuha? First, he excels in any of the most common reaction team archetypes which are centered around the 4 elements which Anemo can swirl: Cryo, Electro, Hydro, and Pyro. The most popular reactions these teams focus on are Melt, Vaporize, Electro-charged, and Frozen, though the same buff can also apply to the Overloaded and Superconduct reactions, which are less commonly used. Let's look at a couple of examples. Ganyu Melt makes great use of all 3 of the utilities Kazuha provides. His burst is particularly useful here because if we time it right, it gets infused with Pyro, which gets us more melts for Ganyu's attacks. For the best results in this team, it is also important to swirl Cryo first so that Kazuha can buff and VV shred boost Ganyu's damage, which makes it a little more complex than it might seem at first glance. This is a good example of how well-designed rotation can be essential for taking advantage of the character's features and making a huge difference to the team's damage output. Ayaka Freeze is one of the most powerful teams in the game and has been considered top team for years now. In contrast to the Ganyu Melt team, this is extremely easy to use and has a very comfortable rotation which flows naturally. There are still some small details which are worth paying attention to. For example, it's worthwhile to use Kokomi just before Ayaka to get the most benefit from the Thrilling Tales Catalyst attack buff, but it's still very forgiving if you stay from the set rotation, and it's particularly easy to get most out of Kazuha in this team. In general, any animal character who can make good use of the VV set is highly valuable in these teams, and with this extra elemental damage buff, Kazuha is particularly great. A less common team archetype, which is particularly dependent on Kazuha specifically, is a team which doesn't rely on elemental reactions at all. The most common element to use for this is Mono Pyro, because it has some very powerful DPS characters, some excellent supports, and provides an extra attack boost through Pyro Resonance, though there are some other potential teams which are worth exploring. Mono elemental teams are comparatively niche and rely heavily on Kazuha's elemental damage buff to keep up with the damage provided by reaction-based teams, but they can be a lot of fun and provide an interesting break from the norm of Genshin combat. So what about Dendro Teams? Since Anemo does not react with Dendro directly, at first glance it's natural to assume that Anemo characters are best left out of Dendro Teams. However, when you look closer, there's actually some great synergy possible here, even beyond the advantage of crowd control. While Anemo cannot swirl Dendro itself, it can swirl the other elements in the team, and the extra swirled instance of that element can interact with Dendro. As a result, Anemo characters are actually able to trigger any Dendro reaction, though it's less reliable compared to applying the elements directly. Teams built around the Catalyse reactions can benefit to some extent from any Anemo support, since they can be used to spread the Electro Aura around and trigger Aggravate, but Kazuha in particular is highly effective here. Since Aggravate are additive reactions, they benefit from all the things, including Kazuha's damage bonus, which can greatly increase the damage output of the team. This Tighnari team is extremely comfortable, with a very fast rotation which causes a ton of damage and takes great advantage of Kazuha's buffs. Its main downside is that the Dendro application is fairly short-lived, since Tighnari's field time is very short, but this rotation is so fast that the Quicken Aura usually lasts more than long enough to keep the reactions going. For a more flashy option, this team with Raiden, Yae, Baizu and Kazuha absolutely destroys anything you put it up against, particularly if you've got enough ER on your Yae to burst consistently on every rotation. Generally speaking, any combination of Electro and Dendro characters plus Kazuha to boost the damage has a good chance of being a very competitive team. Teams built around Bloom and its follow-on reactions can also benefit from Anemo supports for similar reasons, though since they are transformative reactions, their scaling does not benefit from Kazuha's passive elemental damage boost. As a result, he's much less effective in these teams, and there are better alternatives who provide a lot more utility, which we'll look at in a second. There are two other characters currently in the game who can fill the same role as Kazuha, Sucrose and Venti. Their kits have slightly different focuses, and as a result the three of them have advantages and disadvantages compared to one another. Having at least one of them is essential for every account. All three provide great crowd control, and all three are great at triggering swirl reactions, which makes them perfect for holding the VV set. They also require practically an identical build, heavily relying on elemental mastery plus a healthy amount of energy recharge. Despite their similarities, there are slight differences, which means you might prefer one over another in certain teams or against certain enemies. Sucrose provides off-field crowd control, and as a Catalyst user, all of her attacks can trigger swirl. Her biggest advantage is her passive, which increases the party's elemental mastery stat when she hits an enemy with a skill or a burst. Plus, if you have her C6, she also gives a 20% elemental damage bonus for the element infused in her burst. Since she's a Catalyst user, she can also use weapons like Prototype Amber or Thrilling Tales, which provide extra utility. Her main downside is that she's very squishy, and if you don't have her C1, she is extremely energy hungry. Her EM buff makes her extremely well suited to transformative reaction teams like Hyper Bloom or other Bloom related teams, and she significantly outperforms Kazuha in those teams. That buff coupled with her C6 means that she can give Kazuha a run for his money in many other teams as well, though in amplifying or additive reaction teams he generally has an edge. Venti's niche is to provide superior suck. His burst is by far the strongest crowd control in the game. In some situations it can be a bit too powerful, since it can lift the enemies far enough into the air that some characters can no longer hit them. He also helps with the team's energy recharge, so in particularly energy hungry team he can be a very good option. He's generally overshadowed by Kazuha in most teams, or by Sucrose in her niche, but in reality the difference is minor and it's mostly a personal preference without a significant difference either way. Interestingly, his constellations lean towards boosting animal or physical damage, so for whale accounts he can work well in a few niches where Kazuha and Sucrose are poorly suited for. When compared to the other two, Kazuha has quite a few advantages. His Ascension stat is Elemental Mastery, which makes him easier to build. He has a cheaper burst than Sucrose and gives party members a damage buff for the elements he swirls, plus he has the highest personal damage output of the three. He's also the most robust option and lets you very quickly escape by leaping out of danger at the click of a button. He's one of the most flexible characters in the game and provides a ton of value to any account. And even outside of battle, Kazuha's utility in the overworld also can't be overstated. While Venti has the ability to create an updraft, Kazuha has the distinct advantage of being able to cast his skill while in midair. This double jump is a massive win for any exploration gameplay, so most people lucky enough to have him tend to use Kazuha a lot while running around to that. Overall, Kazuha really does deserve his reputation as one of the best characters in the game. He has proven to be incredibly versatile and makes so many other characters shine. If you have any Primo gems to spare, definitely try to get him. He's absolutely worth it. Until next time!